Good night, world. This is Ivan Omer here. I just want to let you know, by the way, I'll be making my Phase 6 announcement anytime now. I finished my formatting. Just a quick note. I'm gonna say this. I sent my file to the company, the formatting company. The formatting company said they couldn't format my book because there were problems with my file, and then I checked my file, and my file was fine. And I finally realized that the doors are locked on me, and I can't even get another company to format my book for me. And so I decided to format it myself on Microsoft Word. So it'll be professional, but it won't be as professional as someone had a formatting company formatted my book, obviously. I'm actually happy because I got my money back, and I was able, now I can actually go over my book again. I can fix all those typos. So the word ale is spelled A-L-E. I can fix that. I can also fix I can go over my book one more time. I can fix all my remaining typos. I only have like 0.2%, 0.1% typos. My book's in pristine form. It's formatted properly. You might have a few, like for the chapter alignments are all good. There's only 2 chapters whereby you might have a bit of a space for the chapter titles, but it's all professionally formatted on Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word is simple, straightforward. You just align the chapters. I posted my map. I posted my chapter titles, my titles for my book. Just for the record, I'll no longer be selling my book as a box set. Remember that Lord of the Rings box set I showed you? I'll no longer be selling my book as a box set. I'm going to sell it as one book. So it'll be one book, and the 3 volumes will be what? There'll be one book composed of 3 volumes. So you know how Lord of the Rings, even though it's 3 separate books, within one book you have like 2 books per book. So Fellowship of the Ring has book 1 and book 2. Return of the King has book 3, book 4, and Two Towers has book 3 and book 4, and Return of the King has book 5 and book 6. Even though it's one book. So it's Lord of the Rings. So Lotr will be one book like this book here, Fellowship of the Ring, but the 3 volumes will be in the one book. That way it's easier, obviously. I could sell it. I could have the 3 volumes sold separately, but it's just gonna cost you more. I'm gonna have to end up charging more money, and because it's one story, I thought it'd be cool to just have it be one book. It's still 3 volumes. It's three separate volumes, but it's gonna be in the one book. I'll sell it for a good $100. So instead of selling it for $190, now that I'll have it as one book, I'll have it as one book, and the 3 volumes will be contained in the one book, and I'll sell it for a good $100-$150 around there. So it's a big book. My book's 190,000 words. Fellowship of the Ring was 177,000 words. So you're probably looking, my book will be single space. I want my book, before I said double space, but I want my book to be single space now. And so if it's single space, it'll be a good like 560 to like 600 page book. So it's a long book, but it's not as long as Lord of the Rings. It's slightly longer than this whole book here. Fellowship of the Rings is the longest of the series, by the way. I caught something. Fellowship of the Ring is actually the longest of the 3 books. Return of the King is the shortest of the 3 books, because Return of the King is only a good 370 pages, and after that you have appendixes. The appendixes, whatever it is. Whereas Two Towers is like 400 plus pages, 450 plus pages, around there, and and Fellowship of the Ring is 530 pages. So my last Horizons book will be slightly longer than this whole book here. So it'll be one book contained, and the 3 volumes will be in the one book. So when you read the book, it's one story, obviously. It's one book, obviously, but you're gonna have the 3 volumes stored in the one book, obviously. So you have Last Horizons by Ivan Omer, beginning of volume 1. Then once you finish reading volume 1 is the prologue to chapter 4. Then you have the end of volume 1. Then you have Last Horizons by Ivan Omer. Then you have beginning of volume 2. And then once you finish reading volume 2, which is chapter 5 to chapter 9, it will say end of volume 2. Then you have Last Horizons by Ivan Omer, and you have beginning of volume 3, which is chapter 10 to chapter 13. And once you finish that, it says the end. And at the end of the book, I posted my map. It says the map of the upper lands and lower lands, and I posted my map. I'll show you guys my layout, my layout of my book in my design, in my phase 6 announcement, which I'll be making at the end of the month. So my book is now done. All I need to do is just go over my book one more time and fix the typos. Obviously, some of the typos are in my book. But my book is done pretty much. It's formatted. I formatted out my Microsoft Word. It's done. Because my wife will be joining for joy, and my wife's joining for joy, obviously. So Victoria Justice, I recommend you travel to a country and get drunk and celebrate. Because my book is now it's ready to be released on Lulu. You're still taking it for granted. And, you know what I'm saying? And with the end of October, I'll be making an announcement. And once I find out how wicked you are, that's it for Ivan Mayer. I'll pump out a few side videos. Because I ran out of ideas for the side videos, I thought it would be cool to do a series. I'll do a good, how much videos can I make in the next, in the next 2, September, October, in the next 2 months, I'll be pumping out videos about Lord of the Rings. I'm gonna do a read along of Fellowship of the Ring. I'll probably do, today I'm gonna read the prologue, and I'm gonna read chapter 1. I'll probably do a couple chapters, a couple of the earlier chapters in Fellowship of the Ring, and I'll end before I make that Swim with the Sharks video in my final announcement. My Swim with the Sharks video I'll make next month. And while I'm doing that, I'll be doing read-alongs of Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. I thought it'd be cool to do a read-along of Fellowship of the Ring. Obviously, to do that, because I'm a Lord of the Rings fan myself. Even though the books are pretty boring, I'm a Lord of the Rings fan. I'm not a nerd because I don't know the ins and outs of Lord of the Rings as well as most fans, obviously. Because for Lord of the Rings, I believe you truly have to really understand the book. You have to do a lot of research. And you also have to read the book at least a few times. You have to go back and reread some sections because J.R.R. Tolkien drags on with the descriptions of the races. He has languages. He has so many lands, so many characters. It's crazy. Hence why what. But I thought it would be cool to do a read along about the prologue of Lord of the Rings for today's video. And I'm gonna do chapter 1, which is Bilbo's 111th birthday. I'll also do a few more chapters after that. Before I thought it'd be cool to read a little bit of Fellowship of the Ring. That way you guys get an idea of how amazing of a book J.R.R. Tolkien wrote. Obviously, even though the book is pretty boring, obviously it's not as good as Zanus. The world building is amazing. Even though I'm not as fluent in the story, obviously, because I wasn't born with a big USB. So if you hear me commenting, I might make a few errors here and there. So you gotta bear with me. So I'm just gonna explain from what I understand. I'm gonna explain the book from what I understand from what I'm reading. Obviously, because I read Fellowship of the Ring and I forgot a lot of stuff that happened in Fellowship of the Ring. And I thought it would be cool for me to delve into Fellowship of the Ring. Today I'll read the prologue. I don't know how long the prologue is. I'll read it. The prologue is a huge drag. I'm not going to talk about the history of the editing of the book and all stuff, because in the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, they talk about the history of the editions of the book, how the book was published, the editing. I'm not going to read that because that's really boring. But I thought it'd be cool to read the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring for this video. How long is the prologue? Let me see how long this is. It's about 20 pages, I think, right? Yeah, 21 pages. So today I'll read the entire prologue. And tomorrow I'll start off with chapter 1, which is Bilbo's 111th birthday. You're looking at a very interesting series for this. The Long Expected Journey, which is Bilbo's 111th birthday. And I'm also going to talk about how and when I read the chapters, it's finally going to hit your mind's world how different the book is from the movies, as Peter Jackson only followed 20% of the book. I don't blame him because Lord of the Rings is a very hard book to follow, and there's so much going on that if you were to follow it word to word, the movie would be a bit messy. Hence why Peter Jackson, for pacing to keep the story pacing, he had to cut out a lot of the details. But I personally believe he should have followed 70% of the book. I believe they should have told it in what? The first movie should have been book 1. Then the second movie, Lord of the Rings should have been 6 to 7 movies. They should have made book 1, and then book 2, and then book 3, then book 4, then book 5, then book 6, and maybe another movie would have been like about the scourging of the Shire and all that stuff. You know what I'm saying? In my opinion, if you hear the noise, excuse the noise, because there's people upstairs, obviously. So I'm gonna start reading the prologue now. And I'm gonna what? Because J.R.R. Tolkien wrote an amazing book, obviously. Right? Now the prologue is called Concerning Hobbits. Okay. So buckle up and enjoy this video, obviously, because I'm gonna read this book, obviously. So I thought because I ran out of ideas for my side videos. I pretty much delve into detail what I want to talk about on my side videos. I thought it would be cool for the next 2 months for me to read Lord of the Rings. So while I pump up my faces now, so in between my Swim with the Sharks video and final announcement, before I make the final announcement, I'll be reading Lord of the Rings. I'll read I'll read the prologue and a few chapters in what? A few chapters in Fellowship of the Ring, and I'll end it there. Obviously. So it's called The Prologue Concerning Hobbits. Okay. So this book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages a reader, so it's about talking about hobbits here, and from its pages a reader may discover much of their character. So J.R.R. Tolkien is pretty much saying, look, this prologue is going to be what about the hobbits, obviously. And once you read the page, you're going to discover what the characteristics of the hobbits, obviously, and a little bit of their history, the races, the families, like the Brandy Bucks, right? I have to do a little bit of research, obviously, to make sure I'm not mistaken. You also have the Brandy Bucks, the family of the Brandy Bucks, obviously. And you have the 3 races of the hobbits that he mentions. I forget the names of the races, obviously, but he mentions it in the prologue, obviously. So the book is largely concerned with hobbits. Hobbits are pretty much what? You guys all saw the movie. They're pretty much small little men, pretty much, right? Like you guys know what hobbits look like because you saw the movie, obviously. And from its pages, a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection of the Red Book of the West March that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit, obviously. Right, so The Hobbit is pretty much, you can say it's a prequel. For those of you guys who know The Hobbit is pretty much a prequel to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But in a way, it's not, because The Hobbit's kind of its own separate book, obviously. Because when J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he didn't write it with the intention of writing Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings came years later. He wrote it years later. So even though The Hobbit you can say is a prequel to Lord of the Rings, it's kind of its own thing. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of its own thing. It takes place 60 years before the events of Lord of the Rings, pretty much, if I'm correct, right? So the section for the Red Book of the West March has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, there and back again, if you don't know what I mean about it. The first Hobbit to become famous in the world, so Bilbo was the most what? He was the most famous Hobbit in the Shire, obviously, and called by him there and back again, like I said earlier. So the Red Book is pretty much Bilbo's tales of his journey, obviously, 60 years before what? The events of Lord of the Rings, and it's called There and Back Again, obviously. And since they told of his journey into the East and his return, so Bilbo Baggins went to the East, and he returned, obviously, to the Shire. An adventure which later involved all the hobbits and great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about his remarkable people from the outset. So the groups of hobbits, obviously, which some may not possess the earlier book. From such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here recollected from the Hobbit lore. By the way, the prologue is a drag to read. I had to really force myself to read the prologue, because the prologue is very, very boring in Lord of the Rings. But you don't have to read the prologue if you read Fellowship of the Ring, but I recommend you read it. That way you get a little history of the hobbits, the races, their dealings with dwarves, men, and elves in the past. You know what I'm saying? All that stuff. But you don't really have to read it, but I read it when I first read Fellowship of the Ring last year, and it was a huge drag to read. As I told you, Lord of the Rings is a pretty boring book. Even though the book's amazing, some sections of the book are boring, obviously. as it's very tough to follow the book because there's so much stuff going on and there's so much information. It's crazy. Obviously. So for such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventures briefly recalled. Obviously, hobbits are unobtrusive, whatever that means, but very ancient people, more numerous formally than they are today. So in the past, there are more hobbits than they are obviously in the present. Obviously, right? For they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth, which is a shire. Obviously, the shire is very peaceful. It's quiet. You know what I'm saying? They like tilled earth, obviously, and well-ordered and very farmed countryside was their favorite haunt, obviously, which is a shire, obviously. The shire is like a country, obviously. They do not understand or like machines more complicated than the forged bellows, whatever that means, a watermill or a hand loom. Though they were skillful with tools, for example, Samwise Gamgee's a gardener, if you read the book. Even in ancient days, they were, as rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and they now avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat, a lot of them are fat, obviously, and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are nonetheless nimble and deft in their movements, whatever that means. I told you, the prologues are dragged to read, man. Right? They possess from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently, when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by. Obviously, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never in fact studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to professional skill and heredity and practice, and a close friendship with the earth. Obviously, have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. Obviously, so you'll see what he means here. J.R.R. Tolkien will delve into the races of hobbits, obviously, in the prologue. But they are little people, obviously. So the hobbits are pretty much little men. The hobbits are closer to men than they are to elves and dwarves, pretty much, right? But they are little people, smaller than dwarves, so they're shorter than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is. Even when they are not much shorter, their height is variable. So they have different heights, obviously, ranging between 2 and 4 feet or of measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled. They say in ancient days they were taller. So supposedly in the past, the hobbits were taller, obviously. According to the Red Book, Bandobras Took, Bullroarer, son of Isambras III, again, there's a bunch of names you got to memorize here, which is tough to memorize, obviously, which I don't memorize, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all hobbits' records only by 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As for the hobbits of the Shire, with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity, they were a merry folk. They dress in bright colors. So they like wearing bright colors, obviously. Like in the movies, what, the Hobbit, you see some of the Hobbits wearing bright colors, that kind of stuff, right? Obviously, right? Hence why, I now understand why Peter Jackson fought twice this book, because this book is fucking hard to adapt. Because there's so much information going on in the book, it's fucking crazy, man. It's also pretty boring, too, the prologue. They dress in bright colors, being nobly found. You get a little history of the hobbits in the prologue and the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, but J.R.R. Tolkien goes into detail in the prologue about the hobbits, obviously. They dress in bright colors, being nobly fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in a thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly known, hence they have hairy feet, obviously. Thus the only craft little practice among them was shoemaking. It's funny that they make shoes, and yet a lot of them don't even wear fucking shoes. That's actually funny. But they had long and skillful fingers that could make other useful and comely things. Their faces were as rule good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter and to eat and drinking. I guess J.R.R. Tolkien is saying that the hobbits weren't necessarily known for being good-looking, whereas the elves are known for being good-looking, obviously, right? And laugh they did, and eat and drink often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and of 6 meals a day when they can get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties. For example, in the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, you have the party of Bilbo when he's celebrating his 111th birthday. And the only reason why Bilbo was able to live for 111 years because he was what? he had the ring. He was busy. He had the ring, obviously. The ring grants you longer life and that kind of stuff. Because the ring is like alive. It's like a magical ring, right? Obviously. And laugh they did, and eat and drink often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times. Sisters is when they can get them. They were hostile and delight in parties and in presents, which they gave away freely. So Bilbo, for example, Bilbo gets given presents in the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, obviously, for his 111th birthday. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangements, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves, obviously. So hobbits are what? Hobbits are closer to men than the elves and the dwarves, because hobbits are pretty much little humans. So they're closer to the male, whereas the elves and the dwarves are more distinct, and they're drastically different from the men and the hobbits. Obviously, that's what he's saying here. It's plain that in spite of later estrangements, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even than dwarves. Of old, they spoke the languages of men after their old fashion, and liked and disliked. So in the past, the hobbits spoke the languages of the men, obviously, whatever language that was, I don't remember. And liked and disliked much the same things as men did. So they have similarities there, obviously. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days, where are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, because the elves lived for what? The elves can live for thousands of years, obviously. They're immortal beings, pretty much. Whereas hobbits and men are not immortal beings, are not immortal beings. All the races have a deep history, but the elves have a very deep history because they can live for thousands of years, obviously. The beginning of the hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own story, in which men appear seldom, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that the hobbits had in fact lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years, right? Became even before folk even became aware of them. Because if the Shire is pretty much what? If the Shire is pretty much what the country of the hobbits, and the hobbits are kind of what? They're kind of locked away from the outside world. And everything to them is a Shire, and the outside world is like what? The outside world is like what? They're kind of separated from the outside world of Middle Earth, right? That's what he's saying here. Yeah, it's clear that hobbits had in fact lived quietly in Middle Earth for many long years before their folk became even aware of them, and the world being after all full of strange creatures beyond account, obviously. So in other words, Frodo and Sam, they truly discover what? The outside world when they leave the Shire, obviously. When Frodo leaves the Shire 17 years later, when he's like 50 years old, right? Because before I said Frodo, yeah, when Frodo leaves the Shire 17 years later, right, when he's 50 years old, that's when Sam and them discover what really lies outside the outside world, obviously. They discover the ring race, they discover the elves like Glorfindel, they discover Tom Bombadil, Mr. Maggot. You know what I'm saying? They meet all these people along the way on their journey, obviously. And then on their way to Rivendell through the ford, right? That's when they meet all the elves, like Elrond. You know, Frodo and them meet Aragorn at Bree. You know what I'm saying? They also meet the manager at Bree. I forget the manager's name. There's a lot of things they left out in the movie, obviously, but he also meets the manager at Bree. The manager of Bree, whatever, of the inns, whatever it is. I forget his name. I have to go back and research that. But I remember they met Aragorn. They also met the manager at Bree and that kind of stuff. Right? And that's when Frodo and them truly discover the outside world of Middle-earth, obviously, when you read Fellowship of the Ring, obviously. And the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond account, these little people seem of very little importance, so they look down on them. I guess hobbits are kind of looked down on, right? But in the days of Bilbo and Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsel of the wise. Here's an interesting quote here. But in the days of Bilbo and Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, Sorry. And with the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond account, these little people seemed of very little importance. So the people who seemed of very little importance, right? Bilbo is the one who found the ring, and he's a little hobbit finds the ring, which is Sauron's ring, the most powerful ring in the Middle Earth, obviously, right? And Frodo was tasked. These little people who are pretty much nobodies, who are not seen as important. Frodo is tasked in destroying that one powerful ring. So out of all the races out of all the races, Tolkien ends up choosing the least important race, right, to end up destroying the one powerful ring. That's why it makes the story so powerful, obviously, right? Because here it says, in the world being after all full of strange creatures beyond account, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and Frodo as heir, they suddenly became by no wish their own, both important and renowned, and the trouble the counsels of the wise and the great, obviously. And as Frodo becomes a hero, Sam becomes a hero, and Bilbo who's a little hobbit. He's the one who discovered the ring, obviously. Those days, the third age of Middle Earth. So the third age is pretty much what? There's 3 ages in Lord of the Rings. The third age is pretty much the events of Lord of the Rings. The end of the third age is the events of Lord of the Rings. And the second and third age predates Lord of the Rings, pretty much. I believe it's thousands of years earlier. I made a video earlier and I said the third age is after. No, I made a mistake. I thought it was after. No, the third age takes place at the end. End of the third age is Lord of the Rings. And the first and second age predates Lord of the Rings. If I'm correct. I might be wrong. So all you Lord of the Rings bookers out there, bear with me as I might make some errors. Because I'm not as well grounded in the story yet. I'm not as well grounded in the story compared to a lot of people. Because I wasn't born with a big USB. And it's hard for me to grasp all this information, obviously. So you have to bear with me, obviously. So those days, the third age of Middle Earth, are now long past. And the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which the hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they linger. The northwest of the old world, east of the sea, wherever that is. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge, a love of learning other genealogical lore. So I guess they had an interest in what the genealogies of the races and all that stuff was far from general among them, right? Sorry, a love of learning other genealogies was far from general among them, obviously, but there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books and even gathered reports of old times, distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. So there's some members in the Hobbit families who studied the history of the elves, dwarves, and the men, obviously. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly look further back than their wandering days. It is clear, hence why the prologue is a fucking drag man, because it's fucking boring. It is clear nonetheless from these legends, and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that like many other folk, Hobbit had in distant past moved westwards. The earliest tales seem to glimpse at a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin. Again, there's a lot of lands you gotta keep track of, man. Anduin, wherever that is, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains, while they later undertook the hard perilous crossing of the mountains into Eredor, is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land. Obviously, so men, obviously, the population of men increased, obviously, in the past, obviously, right? A shadow that fell in the forest so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into 3 somewhat different breeds. Now he's talking about the 3 different races of hobbits, obviously. You have the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Fallenhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides, obviously. So the Harfoots are pretty much darker skinned, smaller and shorter hobbits, obviously. And they were beardless. Beardless hobbits, obviously. Right, like no one cares, right? That's why the prologue, you can just skip through it, because it's not really important to the story. It's just a brief history about the hobbits, their relations with men, dwarves, you know what I'm saying, the races of the hobbits, their way of life, all that stuff. That's why it's a drag to what? It's a drag to fucking read. I'm gonna show my camera here for a sec.